The Evolution of the Bow and Arrow, a Weapon Through Time. Part 2. Where the first part ended, the bow and arrow had already outlived empires, survived the thunder of gunpowder, and faded from the battlefield, yet it never truly disappeared, because unlike weapons designed purely for destruction, the bow carried something deeper, something human, something that could not be replaced by noise, smoke, or speed, and that was the intimate relationship between intention, discipline, and consequence, a relationship that kept the bow alive long after cannons roared, and muskets cracked across the fields of Europe. As firearms spread, many believed the age of the bow was over, yet in quiet places far from the centers of industrial power, archery continued to breathe, to evolve inward rather than outward, becoming less about conquest and more about mastery, less about killing and more about understanding, and it was in this transformation that the bow found its second life. In Japan, long after firearms arrived, the bow remained sacred, not because it was more efficient, but because it demanded something no gun ever could, total presence, and from this belief emerged Kyudo, the way of the bow, a discipline where the act of shooting became a mirror of the archer's inner state, where every movement was deliberate, every breath measured, and every release an expression of harmony rather than aggression. In Kyudo, the target mattered less than the archer's alignment of body, mind, and spirit, teaching that a true shot was one where ego vanished and action flowed naturally, a philosophy that preserved the bow not as a relic, but as a living path of self-mastery. In China, ceremonial archery continued within Confucian traditions, where nobles practiced ritual shooting to demonstrate moral order, restraint, and respect, reinforcing the idea that leadership required control rather than force, and that the steadiness of one's hand revealed the steadiness of one's character. Across the Middle East, master bowyers quietly guarded ancient composite bow knowledge, passing it orally from generation to generation, preserving techniques of horn shaping, sinew layering, and natural adhesives that modern science would later struggle to fully replicate, proving that ancient craftsmanship was not primitive, but profoundly sophisticated. In Africa, the bow remained a practical tool far longer than in most of the world, especially in forested and savanna regions where stealth mattered more than firepower, where poisoned arrows, intimate knowledge of terrain, and patience turned hunters into masters of their environment, and where the bow continued to protect communities long after rifles became symbols of distant authority rather than everyday survival. In the Americas, indigenous archery traditions endured through spiritual belief and necessity, with bows crafted according to seasonal cycles and ancestral guidance, each weapon carrying identity, memory, and responsibility, not merely function. What unified all these cultures was a shared understanding that the bow was never something to be rushed, never something to be mastered quickly, because it demanded repetition, humility, and respect, qualities that modern warfare increasingly abandoned. As centuries passed, the bow retreated from mass conflict and entered a quieter space, kept alive by individuals rather than armies, by craftsmen, hunters, scholars, and seekers who sensed that something vital would be lost if this ancient discipline vanished completely. By the 19th century, as industrialization distanced people from nature and mechanized daily life, a longing emerged for traditions that required physical presence and mental clarity, and archery began to reawaken in the Western world, not as warcraft, but as refinement. Archery societies formed across Britain and Europe, reviving medieval techniques, reconstructing longbows, standardizing targets, and turning an ancient survival skill into a formalized sport. Yet beneath the rules and uniforms remained the same timeless challenge, to still the body, focus the mind, and release with purpose. Victorian archery clubs transformed the bow into a symbol of elegance and discipline, often practiced in formal settings, yet the essence of archery remained unchanged, the same tension, the same breath, the same release that prehistoric hunters once felt. This revival laid the foundation for competitive archery, where precision replaced destruction as the ultimate goal, and where success was measured not in enemies fallen, but in consistency achieved. As the 20th century approached, innovation returned to archery with renewed force, introducing materials that dramatically expanded its potential without erasing its soul. Fiberglass replaced wood, offering flexibility and resilience, aluminum arrows reduced weight while increasing speed, and later carbon fiber pushed performance even further, allowing archers to achieve levels of accuracy once unimaginable. The recurve bow emerged as the perfect balance between tradition and technology, its elegant curves storing energy efficiently and releasing it smoothly, making it ideal for competition and eventually earning its place on the Olympic stage. When archery returned to the global spotlight through the Olympics, it was no longer seen as a weapon, but as a discipline of control, patience, and mental endurance, where athletes stood alone against distance, gravity, and their own thoughts, watched by millions yet guided by silence. Each Olympic archer carried within them the accumulated knowledge of tens of thousands of years, every shot echoing prehistoric hunts, ancient battles, and ritual ceremonies across time. Then came the compound bow, the most radical transformation in archery since the composite bow of the steppe nomads, blending ancient principles with modern engineering through cams and pulleys that reduced holding weight while increasing power, making accuracy more accessible without removing responsibility. Traditionalists resisted at first, just as they always had, yet history revealed a familiar pattern. Innovation never erased the past, it expanded it. Despite mechanical advantages, the compound bow still demanded discipline, timing, and focus, because no mechanism could replace human intention. Bow hunting experienced a powerful resurgence, especially in North America, where ethical hunting emphasized respect for wildlife, clean shots, and intimate engagement, restoring a sense of responsibility lost in long-range firearms, and hunters spoke of heightened awareness, patience, and connection to nature that mirrored the experiences of humanity's earliest hunters. In this way, the bow completed a full circle, returning modern humans to a slower, more deliberate relationship with the natural world, even as technology accelerated everything else. At the same time, traditional bow-making experienced a renaissance, as craftsmen sought to recreate ancient designs using historical methods, rediscovering forgotten techniques through experimentation, failure, and devotion, not merely building weapons, but restoring cultural memory. Museums, reenactors, and experimental archaeologists tested ancient bows against armor, confirming that legends of armor-piercing arrows were grounded in reality, reshaping how historians understood ancient warfare and revealing that early societies were not crude, but brilliant engineers working with nature rather than against it. As research deepened, the bow emerged as one of the most elegant mechanical systems ever devised, capable of storing and transferring energy with astonishing efficiency, and its endurance began to make sense, because it reflected the human condition itself, balancing strength with restraint, power with control, patience with decisive action, teaching consequence with every irreversible release. Even in an age of automation and remote warfare, the bow continued to command respect, not for its ability to destroy, but for its ability to teach presence, accountability, and mastery. And as we move deeper into this story, the focus now shifts to moments when the bow did not merely survive history, but shaped it in silence, moments where a single archer, a single release, and a single arrow changed the fate of kingdoms. Because history is not only shaped by armies and empires, but by moments so small they can pass in a single breath, moments where everything depends on timing, resolve, and the steady release of a string. And throughout history, the bow has been present in those moments, silent, precise, and unforgiving. There are battles remembered not for their size, but for a single arrow that shifted momentum, a single archer whose discipline outweighed entire formations, and these stories reveal why the bow retained its power long after louder weapons appeared. In ancient warfare, archers were often placed behind the front lines, yet their influence reached far beyond their physical position, because an arrow did not need to overwhelm, it only needed to arrive at the right place at the right time. Commanders learned to fear skilled archers not for their numbers but for their precision, because one well-placed shot could fell a leader, break morale, or halt an advance, turning victory into chaos. Legends grew around archers whose skill bordered on the supernatural, not because they defied physics, but because they mastered it so completely that it appeared effortless. In China, tales of master archers spoke of warriors who could strike a leaf in the wind or split an arrow already embedded in a target. Stories meant not as exaggeration but as lessons, emphasizing patience, practice, and mental stillness over brute strength. In the Middle East, legendary bowmen were said to bend composite bows so powerful that few others could even draw them, their arrows piercing armor and shields with frightening ease, reinforcing the idea that mastery elevated the individual beyond the ordinary. In Europe, medieval chroniclers described longbowmen whose volleys fell with such density that the ground itself seemed to bristle with shafts. Yet within those storms of arrows, individual shots still mattered, striking commanders, standard-bearers, and horses, unraveling formations from within. The bow's silence made it especially feared, because unlike gunfire, an arrow offered no warning, no flash, no thunder, only the sudden realization that fate had already arrived. This psychological effect was as powerful as the physical damage, shaping the way armies moved, protected leaders, and planned engagements. As armor evolved to resist arrows, Bows evolved alongside it, increasing draw weights, refining arrowheads, and exploiting weaknesses in joints, visors, and gaps, demonstrating a continuous arms race driven by observation and adaptation rather than industrial output. Yet despite these advances, archery always demanded something rare, time, because mastery could not be rushed, and this became both its strength and its vulnerability in an age that increasingly valued speed. When firearms eventually dominated warfare, it was not because they were superior in every way, but because they democratized violence, allowing power to be wielded without deep training, and in doing so, they stripped combat of intimacy. The bow, by contrast, always demanded accountability, because the archer felt every consequence of a shot, the tension, the release, the flight, the impact, and this connection shaped a different kind of warrior, one who understood restraint as deeply as force. This is why archery remained embedded in rites of passage, ceremonies, and storytelling long after it vanished from battlefields, because it represented a code of conduct as much as a skill. Across cultures, archery was used to teach youth patience, responsibility, and respect for limits, lessons that transcended warfare. As the modern world accelerated, these lessons became even more valuable, drawing people back to the bow as a counterbalance to distraction and haste. Competitive archery evolved into a test of mental endurance as much as physical ability, where the smallest lapse in focus could send an arrow wide, and where success depended on consistency rather than bursts of strength. Olympic archers trained not just muscles, but breath control, visualization, and emotional regulation, echoing ancient philosophies that had long understood the mind as the true source of accuracy. Technological refinement continued, with stabilizers, sights, and tuning systems enhancing precision, yet paradoxically making mental discipline even more important, because the margin for error grew smaller as equipment improved. In this way, modern archery revealed a timeless truth: tools may evolve, but mastery remains internal. Beyond sport, the bow found renewed life in cinema, literature, and popular culture, where archers emerged as symbols of independence and moral clarity, often standing apart from armies and machines, relying on skill rather than overwhelming force. These fictional representations resonated deeply because they echoed ancient archetypes: the lone hunter, the vigilant guardian, the disciplined warrior, figures who act with intention rather than impulse. Through these stories, the bow continued to inspire, not as a relic, but as a metaphor for deliberate action in a chaotic world. At the same time, experimental archaeology and historical reenactment deepened understanding of how ancient bows were truly used, challenging misconceptions and revealing the sophistication of past societies. Researchers tested draw weights, arrow trajectories, and armor penetration, discovering that many myths underestimated the effectiveness of historical archery, and that ancient battles were far more dynamic and lethal than previously believed. This research bridged the gap between legend and reality, restoring respect for archers whose skill had been diminished by modern assumptions. As the 21st century unfolded, archery communities expanded globally, blending tradition with innovation, connecting practitioners across cultures and continents, all bound by the same fundamental experience: the feel of the string, the weight of the bow, the moment before release. In a world increasingly mediated by screens and automation, archery offered something tangible and grounding: a direct interaction with physics, breath, and intention that could not be simulated. It became a form of moving meditation for some, a competitive pursuit for others, and a spiritual practice for many, reflecting the same diversity of meaning it held throughout history. The bow's endurance was no longer a mystery. It survived because it adapted without losing its essence, because it demanded growth rather than consumption, because it rewarded patience over haste. As we move closer to the present moment, the bow stands not as a symbol of the past, but as a bridge between eras, reminding humanity that progress does not require abandonment of discipline, and that ancient knowledge still holds relevance in modern life. And yet, there is one final dimension to this story, one that goes beyond technology, culture, and warfare, a dimension that reveals why the bow and arrow continue to captivate the human imagination, the dimension of legacy, of how a simple idea born from a bending branch continues to shape identity, values, and the way humans understand power itself. And yet, even after everything we've uncovered, there is still a deeper layer to this story, because if the bow survived gunpowder, survived empires, and survived modern technology, then the real question is not how it endured, but why. What knowledge did ancient bowyers possess that modern science is only now beginning to understand? How did certain archers achieve shots that still seem impossible today? And how many moments in history were decided not by armies, but by one unseen archer, standing in silence, drawing a bow while the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance? What secrets were lost when civilizations collapsed? What techniques were deliberately hidden? And what happens when a single arrow arrives at exactly the right moment, striking not just a target, but history itself? In Part 3, we will uncover legendary archers whose names were almost erased, secret bow-making techniques that vanished with fallen empires, and the true stories behind arrows that changed the course of wars and reshaped the world forever. So if you want to know how one shot altered history, why some archery knowledge was buried on purpose, and what the bow still has to teach humanity today, make sure you follow, subscribe, and stay with us for Part 3, because this story is far from over.